Hello everybody, this is Mrs. Pound and I am back with another video for Chapter 8 on the History of Life from BJU Biology's 4th edition. We are talking about Section 8b on biological evolution, and today I want to talk about subsection 8.4 on Darwin's theory of evolution. So our objectives today are to explain the two main aspects of Darwin's theory of evolution and evaluate Darwin's theories in light of the Bible's teachings on origins and nature. Now, first we have to realize that Darwin made his observations that he would later use to support his theory of natural selection in the Galapagos Islands. These are islands in the Pacific. The book he wrote was titled On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, and I want to talk about three key theories that he proposed in this book. The first is the theory of descent with modification. This was part of Darwin's evolutionary theory that states that newer organisms are modified versions of older organisms. It's a lot like this branching tree. Each place where a limb branches off, this would be what Darwin called a common ancestor right here, and then new species would branch off from that. And then you would get up here, there would be a common ancestor and something branching off from that. And so he had all of these common ancestors, and then the base of the tree would be one type of organism from which everything else evolved. This accounts for changes in offspring producing many different forms from a common ancestor. And the common ancestor is a hypothetical organism that supposedly gave rise to two or more types of organisms. And what has been happening is they have not found these common ancestors. Also part of his theory is the theory of natural selection. This is a process that supposedly results in the survival of the organisms that are best suited for their environment. Because as we can see here, there are many ostriches, okay? But not all of these ostriches will necessarily survive. Darwin would say that the ones that survive would be the ones that are best fit for the environment. He based this off the idea of artificial selection, which is man's controlled breeding of organisms in an attempt to influence characteristics. So Darwin observed that when we have artificial selection where man chooses the characteristics that are passed down, the dog breeds change. We've done this with dogs, and we have many breeds that look very different based on what we have selected. And so he thought that nature could do the same thing, except for instead of man choosing the characteristics that are passed down, nature would do that. Now, Darwin based this on observing finches and Galapagos tortoises. And what we would say is that they do not demonstrate evolution, but they do demonstrate natural selection, because as far as evolution is concerned, there are actually different types of evolution. There is microevolution, which there are changes in species, which we would see here. There's macroevolution, where we see one species changing into another. And that has not been observed with Darwin's finches or the tortoises, even though there are changes within the population. Also, an interesting thing that I read in the New York Times a few years ago is there was an article that said that where Darwin observed that the finches were changing and becoming more different, today what we observe with the finches is they are actually becoming more alike. So it's the exact opposite of what Darwin found that is happening today with those finches. Also part of this is survival of the fittest. This is part of Darwin's evolutionary theory that only the organisms best suited to their environment will survive. And as we can see here, there are many different animals here, and Darwin would say that they will not all survive, only the fittest will survive. The important parts of his theory about natural selection and survival of the fittest arose from Darwin's observations that many organisms produce more offspring than can actually survive. So that is what he based this on, is that more are produced than will actually survive, and he said the fittest would survive. However, in nature, the fittest organisms do not always reproduce. So there is a problem with that idea. Also, with Darwin's theory, we can only work with characteristics that are already there. Darwin did not propose any new way that characteristics were produced. That is actually, we'll talk about that in the next video when we talk about later developments after Darwin. Also, part of Darwin's theories that develop from this is environmental determinism, and this is called humanistic Darwinism. And this is when we apply it to humans. And this is the concept that the environment determines an individual's characteristics. So it would also influence their behavior. And environmental determinism is not compatible with Scripture because it places the blame for sin on the environment and takes responsibility for sin from the individual. So it would say that an individual is sinning due to their environment that they are placed in, not because of the choices that they personally make. And Jesus did not die for the sins of the environment. He just died for the sins of you and I. And finally, this is part of Darwin's theory, pangenes, that we do not hold to at all now. Darwin thought that there were factors that cause inheritance of acquired characteristics, and so he was basing this on Lamarck, the acquired characteristics, that Darwin believed originated in organs and traveled to reproductive organs to be passed to offspring. So he was borrowing this from Lamarck, and we've talked about that is just not possible, that we now know that we have DNA and genes that pass on our inheritance. So part of his theory that is not even accepted at all anymore. So our objectives for this video were to explain the two main aspects of Darwin's theory of evolution and evaluate Darwin's theories in light of the Bible's teachings on origins and nature. So don't forget your 5 questions in your notes and keep watching this video to answer the questions at the end.